The sickening crack of my heavy suitcase hitting the imported marble floor echoed through the massive penthouse. It was 2 in the morning. Outside, a brutal Chicago winter storm was tearing through the city, but the real storm was happening right inside this living room. My own brother stood over me holding our parents' recently signed will, while his wife smirked from the velvet sofa. He looked me dead in the eye, called me a worthless burden, and told me I had exactly 15 minutes to get out of his $8 million home. He then tossed me a rusted set of keys to an abandoned rotting factory, completely convinced he had just ruined my life forever. What my arrogant brother did not know was that those rusty keys were about to cost him absolutely everything. My name is Natalie. I am 33 years old and I work as a commercial property appraiser. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your kindness mistaken for weakness by your own family, because trust me, you are going to want to hear how this ends. It had only been 2 weeks since we buried our parents. I was still wearing my black morning dress when Harrison kicked my luggage across the foyer. He adjusted his silk robe, looking down at me with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "The lawyer just left, Natalie," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The will is ironclad. Dad left the liquid assets and this entire penthouse to me. It makes perfect sense. I am the one with the successful hedge fund. I am the one who knows how to manage generational wealth." Naomi, his wife, stepped forward. She was a high-end luxury realtor, always impeccably dressed, even in the middle of the night. She swirled a glass of expensive wine, her massive diamond wedding ring catching the dim light of the crystal chandelier. "You have to understand, Natalie," she said, her tone mockingly sweet. "We really need this space. I have very important VIP clients flying in from Dubai next week, and we are converting your room into a private Pilates studio. Honestly, you should be thanking us for letting you stay this long. A 33-year-old woman still living in her parents' guest room is just tragic." I stared at her, my hands shaking not from fear, but from a rage so deep I could barely breathe. I lived in that guest room because someone had to give our mother her medication at 3 in the morning. I was the one who had to take our father to his endless dialysis appointments while the two of you were vacationing on private yachts in St. Bart's. I sacrificed the entire second half of my 20s for them so you would not have to lift a single finger. Harrison just rolled his eyes and sighed heavily, acting like my words were nothing more than an annoying buzz in his ear. "Nobody asked you to play the martyr, Natalie. You appraise boring suburban strip malls for a living. It is not like you had some massive corporate empire to run. Now wrap this up. The luxury cleaning crew gets here at 6, and I do not want your cheap perfume lingering in the private elevator lobby." He reached into the deep pocket of his robe and pulled out a heavy rusted brass keyring. He tossed it at me with a cruel sneer. It hit my chest hard and clattered onto the floor next to my winter boots. "But do not ever say we did not take care of you," he smirked. "Dad left you the old textile factory down in the South Side. You know, the one with the collapsed roof, the shattered windows, and the massive property tax debt. Congratulations, you are finally a commercial property owner. Try not to get mugged when you go check on your brilliant new investment." Naomi laughed out loud, a sharp grating sound that made my blood boil. She walked over and nudged my suitcase with her designer slipper. "Maybe she can appraise the asbestos in the walls," Naomi chimed in, taking another sip of her wine. "You should probably look into renting a tiny studio apartment way out in the suburbs. Somewhere near the airport fits your budget better. Just take your trash and leave, Natalie. You simply do not belong in this zip code anymore." I did not scream. I did not cry. Breaking down in tears was exactly what they wanted to see. I slowly bent down, picked up the cold, rusted keys, and gripped them so tightly in my fist that they dug into my skin. I looked around the magnificent penthouse at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering downtown Chicago skyline, and then I looked right into my brother's smug eyes. "I will be out of your hair, Harrison," I said quietly. "Enjoy the spectacular view while it lasts." I grabbed the handle of my suitcase and walked out into the freezing hallway. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me, and the sound of the electronic deadbolt clicking into place felt like a physical blow. I took the elevator down 60 floors in pure, deafening silence. When I stepped out onto the icy pavement of the city, the bitter winter wind cut right through my thin wool coat. I had nowhere to go, no savings, and a bank account practically drained from buying medical supplies my brother had flatly refused to pay for. I raised my hand and hailed a passing taxi. The driver rolled down his window, taking one look at my pale face and my single piece of luggage. "Where to, miss?" he asked. I pulled out my phone and looked at the digital copy of the property deed. I gave him the address. He raised his eyebrows and shook his head. "Lady, you do not want to go down there at this time of night," he warned. "It is nothing but abandoned buildings and serious trouble." I just handed him a $50 bill and climbed into the back seat. "Drive," I told him. The cab ride was silent except for the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers pushing away heavy snow. The glittering skyscrapers of downtown Chicago slowly faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the dimly lit, desolate streets of the South Side. Abandoned warehouses loomed like giant shadows against the night sky. The driver pulled up to a towering chain-link fence topped with barbed wire and put the car in park. He looked back at me, his face full of concern, and told me he would wait. I shook my head, grabbed my suitcase, and stepped out into the freezing wind. I told him to go. I stood alone on the cracked sidewalk, staring up at the massive decaying structure my parents had left me. From the outside, Harrison was completely right. It looked like a massive liability. The brick facade was crumbling. The windows were shattered, and graffiti covered the loading dock doors. Anyone else would have seen a worthless pile of garbage that was practically bleeding property taxes. But I was not just anyone. I was a commercial property appraiser. I spent my life looking past the peeling paint and examining the bones of a building. And as I walked closer, shining my phone flashlight against the base of the structure, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The structural columns holding up this rotting textile factory were not standard steel beams. They were massive industrial-grade reinforced concrete pillars, the exact kind used to anchor skyscrapers. This foundation was over-engineered to a ridiculous degree. It did not make any sense for a simple two-story factory to have a foundation built to support 50 stories of dead weight. My parents did not make mistakes when it came to real estate. My father was a quiet, calculating man, and he always had a master plan. I found a side door where the rusty padlock had been broken off years ago. I pushed my way inside the heavy metal hinges, screaming in the silence. The air was thick with dust and the smell of damp concrete. I navigated through the cavernous main floor, stepping over debris and broken glass. I was freezing, exhausted, and effectively homeless, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me moving. I needed to know why my father had left me this specific building. I made my way to the freight elevator shaft and found the concrete stairs leading down to the basement level. The basement was pitch black. I used my flashlight to scan the room. It was empty except for some rotting wooden pallets and water damage along the floorboards. I walked the perimeter, tapping my knuckles against the walls, listening to the sound. Solid brick. Solid brick. Solid brick. Then I reached the far corner near the old boiler room. I tapped the wall. It sounded hollow. I ran my hands along the brickwork and felt a subtle seam where the mortar was actually just painted caulk. I pressed my weight against the section of the wall, and to my absolute shock, a heavy panel shifted inward with a mechanical click. I pushed it open to reveal a narrow corridor hiding a heavy reinforced steel door. It looked like the entrance to a bank vault. Next to the thick handle was a digital biometric scanner completely free of dust. The red standby light was glowing, meaning it was hardwired to an active power grid separate from the rest of the dead building. Harrison had clearly never been down here. He hated getting his hands dirty, and he never bothered to look past the surface of anything. But my father knew I would come. I pressed my right thumb against the glass reader. The machine beeped, a green light flashed, and a series of heavy deadbolts retracted with a loud, satisfying thud. I pulled the heavy door open and stepped inside. The air in the hidden room was warm and climate-controlled. It was a perfectly preserved executive office completely untouched by the decay of the factory above. Leather chairs, a mahogany desk, and a wall of filing cabinets filled the space. On the center of the desk sat a single thick leather-bound folder, illuminated by a small brass reading lamp. I walked over my breath catching in my throat. Etched into the leather in gold lettering were 3 words. For Natalie only. I opened the folder. Inside was a stack of legal documents and a handwritten letter from my father. The first page was a certificate of incorporation for a holding company. The second page was a ground lease agreement. I scanned the legal jargon, my professional training kicking into overdrive. Suddenly, the reality of what I was holding hit me like a freight train. This factory was not just a piece of abandoned property. It was the registered headquarters of a holding company that owned Lot 402. I pulled up the city zoning map on my phone and cross-referenced the lot number. I had to cover my mouth to stop myself from laughing out loud. Lot 402 was the exact parcel of land sitting directly underneath the $8 million luxury penthouse tower my brother had just kicked me out of. Harrison owned the penthouse, but he did not own the dirt it was built on. My parents had given me the ground lease. And according to the contract in my hands, the 99-year lease on that land was set to expire in exactly 30 days. If my arrogant brother wanted to keep his home, he was going to have to pay me. The heater in the back of the cab was broken, rattling uselessly as we sped down the icy expressway. I pulled my thin wool coat tighter around my shoulders, shivering as the glittering skyline of downtown Chicago disappeared behind us. The towering glass penthouses and luxury boutiques gave way to dimly lit streets, boarded-up storefronts, and the skeletal remains of old industry. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled envelope Harrison had thrown at me. Inside was the property deed to the factory. I smoothed the heavy paper out on my lap, clicking on the dim overhead reading light to get a better look. To anyone else, this piece of paper was a death sentence. It was a recorded deed for a defunct textile manufacturing plant located deep in the South Side, complete with a terrifying list of attached municipal liens and overdue property taxes. Harrison had clearly looked at the bottom line, saw the red ink, and laughed. But he was a hedge fund manager who only understood numbers on a screen. I was a commercial property appraiser. I understood dirt. I understood zoning. And most importantly, I understood our father. My dad was a quiet, fiercely intelligent man. He never made a careless financial decision in his entire life. While my mother was busy spoiling Harrison and turning a blind eye to his arrogance, my dad spent his evenings in his study poring over municipal zoning maps and architectural blueprints. He taught me how to read a land survey before I even knew how to drive. He would never leave me a worthless liability out of spite. There had to be a puzzle here hidden beneath the surface of this decaying property. The cab hit a massive pothole, jolting me out of my thoughts. The driver looked at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes wide with genuine concern. "Miss, I really think you should reconsider this," he said, his voice tense. "I have been driving this city for 20 years. This area we are heading into it is a dead zone. There are no streetlights, no open businesses, and no police patrols. Dropping a woman off alone out here at 3 in the morning is just asking for a tragedy. I can take you to a motel near the airport. It will be cheap and safe." I met his gaze in the mirror and offered a small, reassuring smile, though my heart was pounding against my ribs. "I appreciate your concern. I really do," I told him evenly. "But I need to see this property tonight. I have nowhere else to go, and I am not leaving until I understand what I am looking at. Just keep the meter running until we pull up to the gates." "I will be fine." He sighed, shaking his head, and turned the steering wheel sharply. We navigated through a maze of narrow, pothole-ridden side streets until we finally rolled to a stop at the end of a dead-end road. Looming before us in the darkness was my inheritance. It was a monstrous, sprawling brick structure enclosed by a rusted chain-link fence topped with coiled barbed wire. The windows were either shattered or covered in thick, rotting plywood. Graffiti scarred the loading dock doors, and the roof sagged dangerously in the middle under the weight of the winter snow. The cab driver kept the engine running, the headlights illuminating the blowing snow and the absolute desolation of the lot. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" he asked one last time. I handed him the last of my cash, grabbed my suitcase, and stepped out into the biting wind. "Thank you," I said. "Drive safe." The taillights of the cab faded into the storm, leaving me completely alone in the freezing dark. I stood on the cracked asphalt, pulling my collar up against the wind. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of snow hitting the dead weeds, pushing through the pavement. I heard Harrison's mocking voice echoing in my mind, telling me to enjoy my trash, laughing at my predicament alongside Naomi. I shook the memory away and pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight. I bypassed the chained main gate, finding a section of the fence where the wire had been peeled back. I dragged my suitcase through the snow, stepping onto the property. As a commercial appraiser, my first instinct was to assess the structural integrity of the perimeter. I walked toward the main loading bay, shining my light down at the foundation where the brick met the frozen earth. I stopped dead in my tracks. I wiped away a thick layer of snow and dirt from the base of the wall. What I saw made the breath catch in my throat. The brick facade was just a shell. Beneath it, the building was anchored by massive exposed industrial-grade steel, reinforced concrete footings. I knelt down in the snow, tracing the sheer size of the concrete pad with my gloved hand. I had assessed hundreds of warehouses in my career. A standard two-story textile factory from the 1940s would be built on a simple slab foundation or basic trench footings, but this foundation was heavily over-engineered. The diameter of the rebar pushing through the concrete and the sheer density of the load-bearing pads were astronomical. This was not a foundation meant to hold up a rotting brick warehouse. These were subterranean anchors, designed to support the dead weight of a massive vertical structure. It was built to hold a skyscraper. I stood up slowly, the freezing wind entirely forgotten. My father had not left me a pile of trash. He had left me an anchor, and I was going to find out exactly what it was holding down. I brushed the snow off my frozen hands and started walking along the perimeter of the massive foundation. I needed to get inside. The heavy chain-link fence had a gap near the rusted loading dock doors, just wide enough for me to slip through with my suitcase. The main entrance was boarded up tightly with thick plywood, but I knew commercial properties like this always had secondary access points for utility workers. I found a heavy steel fire door tucked in the shadowy alleyway. The padlock had been smashed off years ago by squatters, leaving only a heavy rusted latch. I threw my body weight against the metal. With a loud, echoing screech, the door gave way, and I stepped into the pitch-black interior of the factory. The smell hit me instantly. It was a suffocating mix of damp concrete, decades of undisturbed dust, and the sharp chemical scent of old machine oil. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the cavernous space. Harrison thought he had handed me a toxic liability. I knew exactly what he saw when he looked at the property records. He saw the red flags for asbestos abatement. He saw the crippling property tax debt the city had piled onto the parcel. He saw a financial sinkhole that would drain whatever little money I had left. But as I walked deeper into the main production floor, my professional training painted a completely different picture. I pointed my flashlight up at the ceiling. In a standard mid-century textile plant, you would expect to see wooden truss roofs or light steel joists spanning wide open spaces to accommodate rows of manufacturing looms. But here, the interior skeleton was entirely wrong. I walked over to one of the central support columns and ran my gloved hand over the cold surface. It was a massive high-density steel girder encased in thick, fireproof concrete. I paced the distance between the columns. 20 feet exactly. A perfect grid. My mind raced through the municipal zoning codes for the south side of Chicago. This parcel was zoned as light manufacturing. The structural requirements for an industrial building of this class were minimal. There was absolutely no logical, financial, or legal reason for whoever built this factory to sink millions of dollars into high-rise grade structural steel. The core layout I was walking through was not designed to hold up a two-story brick warehouse. It was the exact structural footprint of a luxury high-rise elevator core. The factory was nothing but a hollow shell, a clever disguise built over a foundation, meant for something magnificent. I needed to see the basement. If the structural anchors went as deep as I suspected, the lower levels would hold the real answers. I found the main stairwell behind the old foreman office. The wooden handrail was rotting, and debris littered the concrete steps. I moved carefully, testing each step before putting my full weight on it. The air grew colder and heavier as I descended beneath the street level. The basement was a sprawling expanse of shadows and standing water. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating old rusted boilers and stacks of decaying wooden pallets. I walked slowly along the perimeter, tapping the heavy masonry walls. I was looking for the structural blueprints, a hidden safe, anything my father might have left behind. I knew him too well. He would not leave me this intricate puzzle without giving me the pieces to solve it. My father was a man of calculated secrets, and this entire building was screaming that it was hiding something huge. As I reached the far north corner of the basement, my flashlight caught the dull shine of a metal box mounted on the brick wall. It was an old industrial electrical breaker box covered in decades of grime. But something about it made me stop in my tracks. The heavy conduit pipes leading into the top of the box were cleanly severed. They led to absolutely nowhere. There was no power running to this section of the basement. Yet the heavy metal latch on the side of the box was completely free of rust, as if it had been maintained, opened, and closed recently. I stepped closer, my heart pounding loudly in my chest. I reached out and pulled the metal latch. The heavy door of the breaker box swung open smoothly on perfectly oiled hinges. There were no fuses inside. There were no wires. Instead, bolted to the back of the hollow metal casing was a sleek, modern digital keypad equipped with a glowing green biometric thumbprint scanner. A tiny LED light pulsed steadily in the dark, powered by an independent hidden battery system. I stared at it, the green light reflecting in my eyes. The brick wall behind this box was not a solid wall at all. It was a door, and my father had left me the only key. I held my breath and slowly reached out, pressing my right thumb firmly against the glowing green glass of the scanner. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then the small machine emitted a sharp affirmative beep. The green light flashed twice. Deep within the solid brick wall, a series of heavy metallic clacks echoed in the silence. It sounded like the intricate tumblers of a massive bank vault falling into place. A sudden hiss of pressurized air escaped from the seams of the false brickwork, and the heavy wall shifted forward just a fraction of an inch. I gripped the edge of the panel and pulled. Despite its immense weight, the reinforced steel door swung open on perfectly balanced hinges, revealing a passageway completely devoid of the damp rot that infected the rest of the basement. I stepped across the threshold, and motion sensors instantly triggered a row of soft, recessed LED lights overhead. The air inside was entirely different. It was warm, dry, and distinctly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of old paper and rich leather. I pushed the heavy vault door shut behind me, the deadbolts automatically re-engaging with a reassuring thud that sealed me off from the freezing, decaying factory above. I walked down the short corridor and stepped into a sprawling, immaculate executive office. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a hidden sanctuary completely untouched by the decades of neglect outside. The floors were covered in thick plush carpeting. A massive mahogany desk anchored the center of the room, flanked by two deep leather armchairs. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with heavy volumes on commercial real estate law, urban zoning codes, and complex corporate tax structures. My appraiser instincts kicked in as I scanned the room. Maintaining a climate-controlled environment of this size completely off the grid and hidden beneath an abandoned building would require a sophisticated independent power source and an absolute fortune in private contractor fees. My father had built this secret bunker for a very specific reason. He was a man who planned 10 steps ahead of everyone else, and this room was the ultimate culmination of his life's work. I walked slowly past the bookshelves, running my fingers over the spines of the leather-bound volumes. For years I had watched Harrison strut around in his custom-tailored suits, bragging about his hedge fund and mocking my steady, quiet career. My brother always believed that flashy cars and loud arrogance were the true markers of success. He genuinely thought our father respected him more. But standing in this hidden room, the truth became crystal clear. My father knew exactly who Harrison was. He knew Harrison was reckless, greedy, and completely blind to the foundational details that actually held an empire together. More importantly, my father knew who I was. He knew I would not just take the rusted keys and walk away. He knew my professional training would force me to look past the shattered windows and the crumbling brick facade. He engineered this entire scenario, trusting that my meticulous nature as a commercial property appraiser would lead me straight down into this basement. He had watched me sacrifice my youth to care for him and my mother, enduring the constant mockery from Harrison and Naomi without ever stooping to their level. He saw my quiet resilience, and he rewarded it with his greatest secret. I approached the heavy mahogany desk. It was completely clear save for a small brass reading lamp and a single object resting perfectly in the center. I reached out and clicked on the lamp, casting a warm, golden glow across the polished wood. Sitting on the desk was a thick, dark brown leather folder. It looked old, but impeccably maintained, the kind of portfolio used to hold highly sensitive legal documents. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding against my ribs like a hammer. Etched deeply into the center of the leather cover, stamped in elegant gold foil lettering, were two simple phrases that brought tears to my eyes. For Natalie, the real foundation. My hands trembled as I reached out and rested my fingertips on the cool leather. Everything Harrison had claimed just hours ago in that penthouse was a carefully orchestrated distraction. The liquid assets, the sports cars, even the luxury apartment itself were just shiny objects meant to keep my brother occupied. The real power, the true core of my family's generational wealth, had been locked away in the dark, waiting for me to find it. I took a deep breath, steadying my shaking hands, and slowly flipped the leather cover open to see exactly what my father had left me. I opened the heavy leather cover. The first page was crisp and thick, bearing the official gold-embossed seal of the state of Illinois. It was a certificate of incorporation for an entity named Ironclad Holdings. I scanned the registered address printed clearly at the bottom of the page. It was the exact street address of this abandoned factory. My father had not just left me a decaying brick building in the South Side. He had left me an active corporate entity, perfectly hidden in plain sight. I turned to the next page, my eyes darting across the dense legal text. It was a master ground lease agreement. In the commercial real estate world, a ground lease is a very specific, incredibly powerful financial tool. It means that one person owns the physical dirt, the actual land itself, while another person or corporation is simply renting that dirt to build a structure on top of it. The developer might own the beautiful building, but they are entirely at the mercy of the person who owns the ground underneath. I ran my finger down to the property description section. The document outlined the geographical boundaries of a massive downtown parcel designated as Lot 402. My breath hitched in my throat. I did not even need to pull up the city zoning map on my phone to know where that was. As a commercial appraiser, I knew every premium lot in Chicago by heart. Lot 402 was the exact parcel of land sitting directly beneath the gleaming 50-story luxury tower where Harrison and Naomi lived. The realization hit me with the force of an earthquake. Harrison had stood in his $8 million penthouse just hours ago, wearing his expensive silk robe, mocking me for being a worthless burden. He and Naomi had bragged about how my dad left him the real estate that actually mattered while literally tossing me the keys to the trash. But Harrison only owned the air rights. He owned the glass, the steel, and the imported marble floors. He did not own the earth beneath it. I did. Through ironclad holdings, I owned the physical ground anchoring his entire arrogant existence. And because the factory was the registered headquarters of the holding company, whoever owned this factory owned the dirt. My father had bypassed the traditional inheritance laws entirely. He knew Harrison would eagerly snatch up the flashy penthouse and the liquid cash, completely ignoring the boring, dilapidated warehouse. My father knew Harrison would never do his due diligence. Clipped to the back of the heavy legal packet was a small piece of personal stationery. I recognized my father's precise, sharp handwriting immediately. The note was short. Natalie, your brother, only values what shines. He never bothered to look down at the roots. You have always been the anchor of this family. I am leaving you the only foundation that matters. Use it wisely. Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them away. My hands were shaking as I flipped to the final page of the contract, searching for the specific terms of the lease. Ground leases are typically signed for a term of 99 years. When the lease expires, all improvements on the land, including any skyscrapers built on top of it, automatically revert to the landowner unless a new, highly lucrative rental agreement is negotiated. I found the execution date. The original lease was signed almost exactly 99 years ago by the developers who first broke ground on that downtown block. My eyes darted to the expiration clause. The 99-year term was set to expire in exactly 30 days. I dropped the document onto the mahogany desk and let out a breathless laugh that echoed through the silent vault. In 30 days, the legal rights to the ground beneath Harrison's magnificent tower would evaporate. If the homeowners association of that building, which Harrison proudly controlled, wanted to keep their luxury condos, they would have to negotiate a brand new ground lease with the landowner. They would have to negotiate with me. If they refused, I had the legal right to seize the entire skyscraper. Harrison had kicked me out into the freezing snow at 2 in the morning because he thought I was a useless loser who appraised strip malls. He thought he held absolute power over my life. He had absolutely no idea that he was currently sleeping in a bed resting squarely on my property. I carefully placed the documents back into the leather folder and closed it. I was no longer a homeless woman freezing in an abandoned warehouse. I was the sole proprietor of the most valuable piece of leverage in the entire city of Chicago. I slid the folder into my briefcase, a cold, sharp sense of purpose washing over me. Harrison wanted to play games with generational wealth. He was about to learn that the woman who spent her life studying foundations knew exactly how to demolish his. I woke up to the sound of my cell phone vibrating violently against the solid mahogany desk. I had fallen asleep curled up in one of the deep leather armchairs, entirely exhausted by the adrenaline crash of the night before. I sat up slowly, blinking against the soft, recessed lighting of the hidden office. Outside, the brutal Chicago winter storm was likely still raging, dumping inches of snow onto the abandoned factory. But down here, in my father's secret sanctuary, it was perfectly still and completely silent. I reached across the desk and picked up my phone. The caller ID flashing on the screen made my blood run cold, but a second later, a sharp wave of clarity washed over me. It was Harrison. I checked the digital clock on the desk. It was barely 8 in the morning. For my arrogant brother to be awake and calling me this early, especially after having his security guards throw me out of his home at 2 in the morning, something had to be seriously wrong in his world. I cleared my throat, carefully, practiced a voice that sounded suitably exhausted and defeated, and answered the call. Natalie. Hey, it is Harrison, he said. His tone was jarringly soft, dripping with a fake practiced empathy that instantly made my skin crawl. Listen, Naomi and I were talking after you left, and honestly, we both feel terrible about how things escalated. The storm outside is absolutely brutal. Where did you end up sleeping? I kept my voice small and shaky, playing the exact role he expected me to play. I am fine, Harrison. I found a safe place to stay for the night. Look, I am calling because I want to help you. He continued, slipping effortlessly into the smooth, persuasive cadence he used to pitch wealthy clients at his hedge fund. I was looking over the property file for that old factory Dad left you. Natalie, it is a complete disaster. There are hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid property taxes, severe structural violations, and the city is probably going to condemn the entire parcel by the end of the month. You do not have the income or the resources to manage that kind of massive liability. I stared directly at the leather folder sitting on the desk in front of me, the folder that held the ground lease to his $8 million penthouse. I knew exactly what he was doing. I know things were incredibly heated last night, he said, lowering his voice to sound intimate and brotherly. But you are still family. I cannot let you drown in Dad's bad debts. I spoke to my accountant this morning and I am willing to buy the factory off your hands for $50,000 cash. We can transfer the deed today. It will get the tax burden completely out of your name, and 50 grand is more than enough for you to put a down payment on a nice, quiet little apartment somewhere out in the suburbs where you belong. My mind went into absolute overdrive, processing the information with the cold precision of a commercial appraiser. Harrison was a ruthless financial shark. He would never hand over $50,000 out of the goodness of his heart, especially not to the sister he despised. He only made moves that guaranteed a massive return on investment. The 99-year ground lease was expiring in exactly 30 days. I knew exactly how developers and hedge fund managers like him operated. They lived entirely on leveraged credit. When you buy a luxury condo on leased land, the bank strictly requires the ground lease to extend at least 20 years past the maturity of the mortgage. With the lease on Lot 402 expiring in 1 month, every single mortgage in that 50-story tower was suddenly in technical default. The homeowners association would be in a state of absolute panic. Harrison's investors were likely breathing down his neck this very morning, demanding the deed to the land to secure their millions. He must have checked the public records at dawn, realized the dirt beneath his empire belonged to Ironclad Holdings, and traced that company right back to this abandoned factory. He was trying to buy a multi-million-dollar piece of leverage for absolute pennies before I could figure out what I actually owned. I let a long, heavy silence stretch over the phone line, pretending to be completely overwhelmed by his sudden generosity. $50,000, I repeated softly, making sure to inject just the right amount of desperate hope into my voice. You would really do that for me, Harrison? Even after everything you and Naomi said to me last night? Of course I would, he replied quickly, sounding just a little too eager. Like I said, you are family. We have to look out for each other when things get tough. So what do you say? Let us meet up, grab a coffee, and sign the transfer paperwork. I can have a certified cashier check in your hands by noon today. He genuinely thought I was stupid. He believed that after years of cleaning up after our parents and staying quiet in the background, I was too broken to see through his pathetic trap. He thought he had backed a desperate animal into a corner. But he had no idea he was dealing with the landowner. Okay, I said, letting a convincing, heavy sigh escape my lips. Okay, Harrison. Send me the address of the cafe. I will meet you there. I hung up the phone and smiled in the silent hidden room. I slid the leather folder securely into my briefcase and locked it. My brother wanted to play a high-stakes game of real estate. He was about to learn that I was the one holding all the cards. The snow was still coming down in thick sheets when I walked into the upscale cafe in the Gold Coast neighborhood. The contrast between the freezing, brutal street and the warm, opulent interior was staggering. The air smelled of roasted espresso and expensive perfume. Wealthy patrons sat at white marble tables quietly discussing stock portfolios and winter vacations. I was wearing the same wool coat from last night, my hair pulled back, carrying the scuffed briefcase that held my father's leather folder. I definitely did not look like I belonged there, which was exactly the point. I scanned the room for my brother, but Harrison was nowhere to be seen. Instead, sitting in a plush corner booth near the floor-to-ceiling windows was Naomi. She looked absolutely flawless. As a high-end luxury realtor, Naomi treated every public appearance like a runway show. She was draped in a tailored camel cashmere coat, her wrists heavy with solid gold bracelets, and a rare crocodile handbag resting on the seat next to her. When she saw me approach, she did not bother to stand up. She just took a delicate sip of her matcha latte and offered a smile that did not reach her eyes. Harrison got pulled into an emergency board meeting, she said smoothly, gesturing for me to sit across from her. You know how it is when you actually manage real money. The market never sleeps. He asked me to handle this little transaction for him. It is really for the best, anyway. I am much better at dealing with the paperwork. I sat down, placing my briefcase on the floor between my feet. I did not order anything. I just looked at her waiting. Naomi sighed a perfectly practiced sound of fake sympathy and reached into her designer bag. She pulled out a crisp certified bank check and placed it face up on the marble table. She slid it slowly toward me. The bold print read $50,000. There you go, Natalie, she said, leaning forward slightly. A fresh start. Harrison practically had to fight his accounting department to free up that kind of liquid cash for a toxic asset, but he is doing it because you are his sister. I looked down at the check, then back up at her. I did not say a word. My silence seemed to agitate her. Naomi crossed her arms, her tone dropping its sweet facade and taking on a sharp, condescending edge. Let us be brutally honest for a second, she whispered, leaning in closer. Look at you. You look exhausted. You spent the night wandering around the south side, probably sleeping in a stairwell. You do not belong in this part of town anymore, Natalie. People in this zip code notice when someone is out of place. This cafe, our penthouse, this entire neighborhood, it is a different league. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the check. Take the money. Go buy a tiny condo out in the deep suburbs. Find a nice quiet place where you blend in with the locals. You can go back to appraising cheap retail boxes and pretend none of this ever happened. If you try to hold on to that rotting factory, the city will bury you in fines and you will end up with absolutely nothing. We are throwing you a life raft. I suggest you grab it before we change our minds. I listened to every single word. I let her class-charged insults and arrogant microaggressions wash over me. I looked at her expensive jewelry, her designer clothes, and her absolute certainty that she held all the power in the world. She sat there dripping in wealth, entirely convinced she was looking down on a pathetic, broken woman. She had absolutely no idea that the piece of paper sitting inside my scuffed briefcase dictated whether or not she would have a home next month. She did not know that her $8 million penthouse was a temporary castle built on my permanent dirt. If I wanted to, I could bankrupt her and my brother before their morning coffee got cold. But I was not going to give them the satisfaction of a public screaming match. I kept my expression completely blank. I raised my hand and placed my index finger on the edge of the certified check. I applied just enough pressure to slide it slowly, deliberately right back across the marble table until it bumped against her coffee cup. Naomi frowned, clearly confused. "What are you doing?" she snapped. I looked right into her eyes, my voice steady and cold as ice. "I am keeping the factory." The fake sympathetic smile on Naomi's face vanished instantly. The mask completely shattered. Her perfectly contoured features twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Just as Naomi slammed her hand onto the table, the brass bell above the cafe entrance chimed aggressively. Harrison stormed through the double doors. He did not look like the composed, arrogant hedge fund manager who had kicked me out of his home just hours ago. His expensive cashmere overcoat was unbuttoned, his tie was slightly crooked, and his face was flushed. He spotted us in the corner booth and marched over his heavy footsteps, drawing the annoyed attention of the quiet, wealthy patrons around us. He ignored them completely, his eyes locked onto me with a frantic, undeniable panic. He did not even bother to say hello. He grabbed the back of an empty chair and leaned heavily over the marble table, glaring down at me. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Natalie?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and fury. Naomi just texted me that you refused the check. Are you completely out of your mind? I am offering you a golden ticket out of the massive financial hole Dad dug for you. I looked up at him, my expression perfectly flat. I already told your wife, Harrison, the factory is not for sale. I am going to hold on to my inheritance. Harrison let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed a little too loudly in the elegant cafe. A few heads turned in our direction, but he was too desperate to care about his public image right now. Your inheritance, he sneered, slamming his hand down on the tabletop. Your inheritance is a toxic waste dump. Do you have any idea what the holding costs are for a condemned commercial parcel in that zoning district? The city is going to come after you for $300,000 in back taxes by the end of the quarter. Means the city seizes the land and it goes to the city. It's a municipal foreclosure, means the city seizes the land and it goes to public auction. I am offering you a guaranteed exit strategy. You take the 50 grand sign, the quitclaim deed right now, and I will deal with the massive legal mess our father left behind. I knew exactly what he was doing. If the property went to public auction, Harrison would have to bid against massive commercial developers who would immediately spot the hidden value of the ground lease. He needed a private, quiet transfer today to save his own skin. Naomi leaned back, recovering her vicious demeanor. She crossed her arms and smiled a predatory smile. Listen to your brother, she whispered, swirling the dregs of her expensive latte. I work with the biggest developers in Chicago. We know how to play dirty when someone holds up progress. We will file injunctions against you personally. We will freeze your bank accounts. We will tie that property up in probate litigation so fast your head will spin. By the time my lawyers are done with you, you will be begging us to take that property off your hands for free. You do not have the stamina for a corporate war, Natalie. I sat there watching them unravel. If Harrison actually believed the factory was a worthless liability, he would have never left an emergency board meeting to scream at me in a coffee shop. He would have just let me fail. His absolute rage was the ultimate confirmation of my power. I slowly reached down and picked up my scuffed briefcase. I stood up from the booth, taking a moment to adjust my thin wool coat. I looked from my panicked brother to his incredibly arrogant wife. You two seem incredibly stressed for people who just inherited an $8 million penthouse and a massive stock portfolio. I said calmly, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. Keep the 50 grand, Harrison. Put it toward your next mortgage payment. It sounds like you are going to need it a lot more than I will very soon. I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit. Harrison shouted my name, demanding I come back and sit down, his voice cracking with a pathetic desperation that made my stomach turn. I did not look back. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped back out into the freezing Chicago storm. I walked down the snow-covered pavement, putting a solid block between myself and the cafe. I reached into my coat pocket to pull out my gloves, but my fingers brushed against my cell phone. The screen was lit up with a high-priority alert from the Chicago Department of Buildings. Because I was a licensed commercial appraiser, my professional email was registered to receive automated zoning and violation updates for any parcel I flagged. Last night, sitting in the cab, I had flagged Lot 402. I stopped walking and opened the attached digital document. My heart skipped a beat. It was an expedited municipal notice. A city inspector had just visited my property less than an hour ago. He had slapped a Class A emergency demolition order on the building citing immediate structural hazards, failing load-bearing walls, and severe danger to the public. The order stated the building was unfit for entry, and the city had the right to bulldoze the entire parcel to the ground in exactly 48 hours, unless the owner immediately sold to a qualified developer who could guarantee safe remediation. My blood boiled. This was not a coincidence. Naomi was a high-end luxury realtor who rubbed elbows with corrupt politicians and zoning board directors. She knew she could not bully me into selling the property legally, so she called in a dirty favor to destroy it completely. They were trying to erase my leverage with a wrecking ball before I even had a chance to claim my rights. They thought they had backed me into a fatal corner, but they forgot one crucial detail. They were trying to outsmart a licensed commercial property appraiser on her own turf, and I knew the structural engineering codes better than anyone in this entire city. I did not waste a single second. I flagged down a passing taxi, shoved a crumpled $20 bill at the driver, and gave him the address to the factory. The entire ride down the icy expressway, my mind was racing, calculating every legal and procedural loophole in the Chicago Municipal Code. Emergency demolition orders do not just happen overnight. They require a mountain of paperwork, extensive structural engineering surveys, and multiple levels of bureaucratic approval from the city planning board. For a notice to be slapped on my property this fast, someone had to bypass the entire legal system. Naomi had pulled a massive, highly illegal string. She was using her connections in the luxury real estate market to weaponize the city government against me. The cab pulled up to the chain-link fence of the factory, and I immediately saw the flashing amber lights of a Chicago Department of Buildings utility truck. It was parked right near the loading dock engine, idling in the cold. A man in a heavy, high-visibility jacket was wrapping bright yellow caution tape around the main gate. He was whistling a cheerful tune, looking entirely too relaxed for someone supposedly dealing with an imminent building collapse. I stepped out of the cab, my boots crunching loudly in the fresh snow, and marched straight toward him. "Hey!" I shouted over the biting wind. "What exactly do you think you are doing to my property?" The man stopped whistling and turned around. He had a smug, fleshy face and a metal clipboard tucked casually under his arm. The name tag on his jacket read Davis. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my thin coat and wind-blown hair, clearly unimpressed. Naomi had probably described me to him as a clueless, hysterical woman who would break down in tears at the first sign of official city paperwork. "I am putting up a hazard perimeter," Lady Davis said, his tone dripping with heavy condescension. "This entire parcel has just been designated as a Class A structural liability. The load-bearing walls are bowing, the roof is caving in, and the foundation is completely compromised. Step back behind the street lamp before a brick falls and cracks your head open." I crossed my arms and stood my ground, staring him down. "I am the registered owner of this property," I said sharply. "And I know for an absolute fact that no structural engineer has set foot on this site in the last 10 years. You cannot condemn a commercial building based on a drive-by glance. Where is your core sample data? Where is your stress test report?" Davis chuckled, an ugly grating sound that made my blood boil. He tapped his metal clipboard with a thick gloved finger. "I am a senior city inspector, sweetheart. My signature on this paper is all the engineering proof the city needs. This building is a massive death trap. You have exactly 48 hours before the bulldozers roll in and flatten this place to dust. And when they do, the city will bill you directly for the demolition costs, the cleanup, and the hazardous material disposal. You will be completely bankrupt before Friday morning." He paused, leaning in a little closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially, as if he were about to do me a massive favor. "Now, if you want to save yourself a massive financial headache, there is a legal loophole. The city will halt the demolition order if you transfer the deed today to a qualified bonded developer, someone with the capital to safely remediate the site. I happen to know a few high-end investment firms who might take this nightmare off your hands for a small fee. Just sign the paper, walk away, and let the real professionals handle it." He was reciting Naomi's script word for word. It was almost pathetic how obvious they were being. They really thought this cheap intimidation tactic would work. They thought waving a piece of yellow tape and a fake city order in my face would terrify me into signing over a 99-year ground lease worth millions. My brother and his wife had severely underestimated exactly who they were trying to bully. I did not cry. I did not scream about how unfair the system was. I did not beg him to give me more time. I simply stared at him with absolute icy calm. "Do whatever you want with that yellow tape, Davis," I said softly. I set my scuffed briefcase down directly on the hood of his running city truck. I snapped the brass latches open. I reached inside, completely ignoring the leather folder holding the ground lease, and pulled out two very specific items. The first was a heavy state-issued structural load-bearing manual. The second was a high-grade commercial laser measuring tool. Davis frowned, the smug smile slowly fading from his face as he realized I was not running away. "What are you doing?" he asked defensively. I turned on the laser, a sharp red dot appearing on the heavy steel-reinforced concrete footing just behind him. "I am going to do your job for you," I replied. "And then I am going to make sure you lose it." I did not wait for Davis to respond. I walked straight past him and spent the next 20 minutes taking precise laser measurements of the exposed reinforced concrete footings. I documented the diameter of the rebar, calculated the span of the steel girders, and cross-referenced everything with my manual. Davis stood by his truck, shivering in the cold, yelling empty threats about calling the police. I ignored him entirely. When I had exactly what I needed, I packed my tools, got back into my waiting cab, and told the driver to take me straight to Chicago City Hall. An hour later, I was marching through the polished marble corridors of the Chicago Department of Buildings. My boots left wet tracks on the floor, and I was still freezing, but I walked with the absolute authority of a woman who knew she held the winning hand. I bypassed the front reception desk, completely ignoring the protests of the security guard, and pushed open the heavy glass doors to the senior zoning division. Luck was entirely on my side. Davis had just arrived and was standing at the desk of the chief director of inspections, a stern-looking man named Reynolds. Davis was handing over his clipboard, no doubt trying to fast-track the demolition order Naomi had paid him to file. "Excuse me, Director Reynolds," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet office like a knife. The entire room stopped and turned to look at me. I walked right up to the desk, slammed my heavy structural manual down next to Davis's clipboard, and placed my laser measurement logs on top of it. "My name is Natalie, and I am the registered owner of Lot 402. Your inspector here just illegally condemned my property without a single valid structural test, and I am here to give you the opportunity to fix it before I sue this entire department for municipal fraud." Davis turned pale. He puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his authority. "Director, this woman is belligerent. Her building is a Class A hazard. The walls are coming down." I turned to Davis, locking my eyes onto his. "Shut your mouth and listen to a real professional. I am a licensed commercial property appraiser for the state of Illinois." I opened my logbook and pointed to the data. "You cited a failing foundation. Did you know that the concrete footings on my property extend 40 feet into the bedrock? Did you know the rebar density is rated to support a live load of over 4,000 pounds per square inch?" I turned back to the director, who was now staring at my numbers with widening eyes. "That foundation was over-engineered 99 years ago to support a 50-story high-rise elevator core. The brick warehouse on top of it is just a cosmetic shell. It could completely collapse, and that steel foundation would not even flinch. To legally condemn a Class S structural grid in this city, you need a full seismic stress test, a signed affidavit from an independent architectural firm, and a 3-month warning period. Inspector Davis did none of that. He drove up, slapped a sticker on the fence, and tried to force me into a distress sale with a private developer. The silence in the office was deafening. Every other clerk and inspector was staring at us. Director Reynolds looked from my precise, undeniable mathematical logs to Davis's completely blank hazard report. He did not need to be a genius to see what was happening. City officials were terrified of two things: bad press and massive federal lawsuits. I was practically handing him both on a silver platter. Davis Reynolds said, his voice dangerously low. "Where are your core samples for Lot 402? Davis stammered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold weather outside. "Sir, the visual deterioration was so severe that I made an executive judgment call. The neighborhood's safety is at risk." Reynolds snatched the demolition order off the desk and ripped it exactly in half. "An executive judgment call does not override state engineering codes, you absolute fool." He threw the torn paper into the trash can. The demolition order is revoked immediately. You are suspended pending a full internal review. Hand over your badge and wait in my office." Davis looked like he had just been physically struck. He opened his mouth to argue, but Reynolds pointed a sharp finger toward his office door, leaving absolutely no room for debate. I quietly packed my laser logs back into my scuffed briefcase. I gave Director Reynolds a polite nod, thanked him for his time, and turned to walk out of the department. As I pushed the heavy glass doors open to leave, I glanced back over my shoulder. Davis was leaning against the wall, his hands shaking violently as he typed a frantic text message on his cell phone. I knew exactly who he was texting. Naomi was about to get the worst news of her entire miserable life. Her dirty plan had completely failed, and the wrecking ball had just swung right back in her direction. The freezing air felt entirely different as I walked out of City Hall. It felt crisp, sharp, and intensely energizing. I pulled my thin wool coat tight against the biting wind and walked 2 blocks down Washington Street to a quiet public library. I needed a secure internet connection and a place to sit down. My heart was still racing from the confrontation with the corrupt inspector, but my analytical mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. The emergency demolition order was an incredibly desperate, sloppy move. Naomi and Harrison were playing reckless, and that meant they were terrified. A high-rolling hedge fund manager and a luxury realtor do not panic over a dilapidated warehouse, unless that warehouse poses a direct, catastrophic threat to their bottom line. Offering me $50,000 this morning was not an act of brotherly charity, and it was not just a simple attempt to steal a valuable piece of land. It was a panicked attempt to plug a sinking ship. I found an empty desk in the back of the silent reference section, opened my scuffed briefcase, and pulled out my laptop. As a licensed commercial property appraiser, I had secure login credentials to the most comprehensive real estate and financial databases in the country. I bypassed the public search engines and logged directly into the institutional commercial registry. I typed in the name of Harrison's firm, Summit Edge Capital. Hedge funds are notoriously secretive, usually hiding their assets behind dozens of anonymous shell companies and offshore accounts. But commercial real estate is entirely different. You cannot hide a 50-story glass skyscraper. Dirt and concrete leave a massive, undeniable paper trail. I started cross-referencing the property records for the luxury tower where Harrison and Naomi lived. I pulled the master deed, the financing history, and the recent acquisition logs. What I saw on the screen made my jaw physically drop. Harrison had always bragged about his massive wealth, acting like he was an untouchable titan of Wall Street. He treated me like dirt because my bank account did not have enough zeros. But looking at the raw financial data, the truth was pathetic. Harrison did not just own his $8 million penthouse. 2 years ago, Summit Edge Capital had purchased the controlling interest in the entire building from the original developers. But he did not buy it with cash. He bought it with massive, crushing debt. I downloaded the commercial mortgage-backed security filings. Harrison had leveraged his entire hedge fund to secure a staggering $300 million loan to buy the residential tower. He used his investors' money as collateral, betting everything his firm had on the continued appreciation of the luxury condos inside. But Harrison made a fatal amateur mistake. He was so blinded by the shiny glass and the imported marble that he never bothered to thoroughly investigate the ground beneath it. He assumed the original developers owned the land outright. I opened the loan covenant, scanning the dense legal text for the one specific clause that governs every commercial mortgage built on leased land. I found it on page 47, the lender requirements. It stated in black and white that the underlying ground lease must remain active and valid for a minimum of 20 years beyond the maturity date of the commercial loan. If the ground lease ever drops below that threshold, or if it expires completely, the entire $300 million loan goes into immediate, incurable default. I leaned back in the hard wooden library chair, staring at the glowing screen. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. The puzzle was finally complete. The ground lease held by my father's company Ironclad Holdings was expiring in exactly 30 days. Harrison was not a billionaire. He was entirely broke. His entire financial empire was a fragile house of cards built on my dirt. The moment the clock struck midnight 30 days from now, the bank's automated systems would flag the expired ground lease. The massive corporate lender would instantly call in the $300 million loan. Because Harrison's fund was entirely over-leveraged, he would not be able to pay it back. The bank would foreclose on the entire skyscraper, seizing every single luxury condo, including his own penthouse. His wealthy investors would lose absolutely everything, and they would crucify him for corporate negligence. He would face severe federal fraud charges for hiding a toxic asset from his clients. This was never about a $50,000 tax debt. Harrison was literally 30 days away from total financial and criminal ruin. He needed the deed to the factory today to secretly renew the ground lease and hide his catastrophic mistake from the bank. And now, thanks to my father, I was the only person on earth who possessed the power to sign that renewal. They tried to throw me out into the snow to freeze. They tried to bulldoze my inheritance, but as I closed my laptop, I knew the war was already over. I had my hand resting directly on the detonator, and I was going to let the clock run out. I walked out of the library with a singular razor-sharp focus. Harrison was hosting his annual Summit Edge Capital Charity Gala that very evening. It was a massive, ostentatious event held at one of the most exclusive venues in Chicago designed for one specific purpose. He needed to dazzle foreign investors and secure fresh capital to keep his over-leveraged hedge fund afloat. He was desperately trying to reel in the biggest whales in the commercial real estate market to save himself from the impending default. I looked down at my scuffed boots and my thin wool coat. If I was going to crash a billionaire's playground and tear down my brother's facade, I needed the right armor. I walked into a high-end designer boutique on the Magnificent Mile. I pulled out my only remaining credit card, the one I kept for absolute emergencies, and maxed it out entirely. I bought a stunning floor-length emerald silk gown that draped perfectly a pair of designer heels and paid for professional hair and makeup. By the time I was finished, the exhausted freezing woman, who had been kicked out into the snow at 2 a.m, was completely gone. Staring back at me in the dressing room mirror was a woman who owned the ground beneath their feet. I looked like a titan of industry, and I was ready to play their game. The gala was a blinding display of fake wealth. Valets parked lines of exotic sports cars, while Chicago's elite filed up the grand stone steps of the venue. I handed my coat to the cloakroom attendant and stepped into the main ballroom. It was breathtaking. Waiters in crisp white jackets carried silver trays of vintage champagne, and a live string quartet played softly from a raised stage. I took a glass of champagne and seamlessly blended into the crowd. For years I had stayed in the shadows, quietly taking care of our parents, while Harrison demanded the spotlight. But tonight I moved through the room with absolute unshakable authority. It did not take me long to spot them. Harrison and Naomi were standing near the VIP lounge holding court. Naomi looked radiant, in a custom silver sequined gown, her heavy diamond jewelry catching the light as she laughed at a joke. They were entirely focused on an older, distinguished man standing across from them. I recognized him immediately from my industry research. It was Mr. Kenji Tanaka, a massive institutional investor from Tokyo, known for acquiring major stakes in Chicago high-rises. Harrison was practically sweating through his custom tuxedo, leaning in desperately as he pitched Tanaka on a new portfolio of luxury developments. He was trying to secure the lifeline that would save him from the bank. I took a slow sip of my champagne and started walking directly toward them. Naomi saw me first. I watched her perfectly manicured hand freeze in midair. Her eyes widened in absolute shock, scanning my emerald gown and confident posture, completely unable to process how the sister-in-law she had discarded had infiltrated her exclusive event. That shock instantly morphed into pure venomous rage. She whispered something quickly to Harrison, who turned pale, and then she broke away from the group. She marched straight toward me on a deliberate collision course. She intercepted me behind a towering marble column, violently grabbing my arm to pull me out of sight from their wealthy guests. "What the hell do you think you are doing here?" she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "You are trespassing. You do not belong here, and you are going to ruin everything. I am calling security right now to have you dragged out of this building in handcuffs." She aggressively raised her hand to signal two massive security guards standing near the ballroom exit. I did not flinch. I calmly reached down and peeled her fingers off my silk gown one by one, looking at her with total disgust. "I am not here for you, Naomi," I said smoothly. I stepped around her, leaving her standing frozen and humiliated behind the pillar, and walked straight up to the VIP circle. The two security guards were already moving toward me, their hands reaching out to grab my shoulders, but they were too late. I stepped right into the center of the group, completely ignoring Harrison's terrified, pleading expression. "Mr. Tanaka," I said, projecting my voice loudly and clearly over the string quartet so that everyone nearby turned to listen. "It is an absolute pleasure to finally meet you. My name is Natalie, and I am a licensed commercial property appraiser. I understand my brother here is pitching you on his luxury high-rise portfolio. I would love to discuss the severe legal liabilities regarding his underlying ground leases before you sign a single check." The string quartet seemed to fade into the background as my words hung in the air. Mr. Tanaka slowly lowered his crystal champagne flute. He was a man who had built a global empire by sniffing out risk, and the phrase legal liabilities was an instant trigger. He looked at me with sharp, calculating eyes, taking in my emerald gown and my completely unwavering posture. He did not see a party crasher. He saw a peer. "Ground leases, you say?" Mr. Tanaka asked, his thick accent clipping the words with precision. Harrison assured me that Summit Edge Capital holds absolute title to all flagship properties in the current portfolio. Are you telling me this is inaccurate? Harrison opened his mouth, his face turning an alarming shade of red. But before he could stammer out a lie, Naomi pushed her way back into the VIP circle. She had plastered on her signature 1,000-watt luxury realtor smile, but I could see the sheer panic vibrating in her jawline. She grabbed Harrison's arm tightly and let out a high-pitched musical laugh that sounded entirely unnatural. "Mr. Tanaka, please forgive the interruption," Naomi chimed in, stepping deliberately between me and the billionaire. "This is just a little family misunderstanding. Natalie here is Harrison's estranged younger sister. She is going through a very difficult mental health crisis right now. We let her stay in one of our old rundown storage warehouses out of charity, but unfortunately, she has started squatting there and having these terrible delusions of grandeur." Naomi turned to me, her eyes filled with pure venom, while her mouth maintained that terrifying pageant smile. "Natalie, sweetie, you cannot just put on a nice dress, sneak into a corporate event, and pretend to be a financial analyst. You are a low-level clerk who measures suburban strip malls. You do not understand high finance. Mr. Tanaka is dealing with fee-simple, absolute acquisitions and unencumbered air right depreciations. Go wait in the lobby before we have to call a doctor for you." The other wealthy investors in the circle murmured, casting uncomfortable glances my way. Naomi had played the crazy sister card, beautifully wrapping it in just enough real estate buzzwords to sound authoritative to a layman. But Kenji Tanaka was not a layman, and I was certainly no clerk. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Naomi sweat. Then I smiled. It was a cold, surgical smile. "Unencumbered air right depreciations," I repeated, letting the phrase roll off my tongue like a bad joke. "Naomi, you are a residential broker who sells shiny kitchens to professional athletes. Please do not try to use commercial structuring terms you clearly read on the internet 10 minutes ago. Air rights do not depreciate. They are an intangible asset, and you certainly cannot claim a fee-simple absolute acquisition when the primary collateral of your husband's hedge fund is built on a subordinate leasehold estate." Naomi's fake smile completely collapsed. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked frantically at Harrison for help, but he was paralyzed, staring at me like I was holding a live grenade. I turned my attention back to the billionaire, completely dismissing my sister-in-law. Mr. Tanaka, a fee simple estate means you own the building and the dirt underneath it. A leasehold estate means you only own the building and you rent the dirt. Summit Edge Capital does not own the dirt under their flagship residential tower. They rent it. And according to my professional appraisal, that ground lease expires in exactly 30 days. When it does, the senior lender will immediately call in the $300 million mortgage, and every single investor who poured money into this fund will be wiped out completely. The VIP circle went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop on the marble floor. Mr. Tanaka did not look at Naomi, and he did not look at Harrison. His sharp eyes were locked entirely on me. He recognized the brutal, undeniable accuracy of my terminology. I was speaking the language of a true institutional appraiser, a language Naomi could not even begin to fake. "Is this true, Harrison Tanaka?" asked, his voice suddenly stripped of all politeness. It was the voice of an apex predator who had just realized he was being led into a trap. Harrison swallowed, hard beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "Kenji, please let us go to the private lounge. I can explain the financing structure. My sister is wildly exaggerating a minor administrative renewal." "I am not exaggerating anything," I interrupted, smoothly pulling a sleek silver business card from my clutch and handing it directly to the billionaire. "I know the exact terms of the lease because my holding company owns the land. Do your own due diligence, Mr. Tanaka. Check the county registry for Lot 402. If you wire my brother a single dollar before that lease is secured, you are throwing your money into an incinerator." Mr. Tanaka held my silver business card between his fingers, tracing the embossed lettering with his thumb. His face was completely unreadable, a stone wall of corporate discipline and terrifying intellect. He slowly looked up from the card and shifted his dark, calculating gaze to Harrison. The silence between them was heavier than concrete, completely suffocating the cheerful music playing in the background. Harrison was unraveling before my eyes. He reached out, his hands visibly shaking, trying to herd the billionaire toward the secluded VIP lounge away from prying ears. "Kenji, please," Harrison pleaded, his voice cracking with a pathetic desperation. "This is nothing but an elaborate stunt. She is a disgruntled family member trying to extort me because our father wrote her out of his will. I have the fee, simple, absolute paperwork in my office, safe right now. Let us go upstairs, pour some scotch, and I will show you the exact title insurance policies. I can prove everything." I did not back down an inch. I took one smooth, deliberate step closer to Mr. Tanaka, effectively invading the space between him and my brother. I lowered my voice, cutting out the background noise of the gala, speaking directly and privately to the billionaire. "Check the ground lease on Lot 402 before you wire him a single dollar," I whispered, ensuring only he and his closest executive assistants could hear the precise legal details. "The registered landowner is Ironclad Holdings. The municipal registry will confirm the expiration date is exactly 29 days from midnight tonight. The second that clock runs out, his senior lender will trigger an incurable default covenant. If you buy into Summit Edge Capital tonight, you are not buying premium luxury real estate. You are buying a $300 million unsecured liability. You will lose your entire investment, and your board of directors will hold you personally responsible for failing to conduct basic due diligence." I watched the exact moment the final nail was driven into my brother's coffin. Mr. Tanaka was not a man who gambled on glaring red flags. In the high-stakes world of institutional investing, a lie of omission was an absolute unforgivable offense. A hedge fund manager who failed to secure the dirt beneath his flagship asset was either dangerously incompetent or actively committing financial fraud. Neither option was acceptable to a man who managed billions. Tanaka did not yell. He did not cause a public scene. He simply turned his head and signaled to his lead assistant. The assistant immediately pulled out a cell phone and began typing frantically, no doubt ordering their legal team to freeze all pending wire transfers to Summit Edge Capital immediately. Tanaka handed his half-empty crystal champagne flute to a passing waiter. He looked at Harrison with absolute freezing contempt. A man who does not understand the foundation of his own house has no business building an empire for others, Tanaka said quietly, his words cutting deeper than any blade. Your lack of transparency is a direct insult to my firm. We are officially withdrawing our letter of intent. Do not ever contact my office again. Without another word, Kenji Tanaka turned his back on my brother. His security detail and executive entourage immediately formed a protective wall around him, and the group walked swiftly toward the exit. The biggest whale in the commercial real estate market, the singular financial lifeline that was going to save Harrison from total ruin, had just walked right out the front door. The ripple effect across the ballroom was instantaneous. The other wealthy investors in the VIP circle had heard enough of the exchange to know something was catastrophically wrong. Whispers spread through the elegant crowd like wildfire. Cell phones were pulled out from tuxedo pockets. Men and women began stepping away from the Summit Edge Capital promotional banners, physically distancing themselves from a sinking ship. Naomi was standing by the marble column, her face entirely drained of color. Her heavy diamond jewelry suddenly looked like cheap costume plastic against her pale, sweating skin. She was breathing rapidly, her chest heaving as she realized that her luxurious, untouchable life was evaporating into thin air. She had tried to mock me for being a low-level clerk, but now she was watching her entire social and financial standing burn to the ground. But Harrison did not freeze. The polished, arrogant facade of the brilliant hedge fund manager completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but a cornered, desperate animal. He watched his investors walking away, he watched the whispers spreading, and he realized in one agonizing second that his entire career was over. He was going to lose his penthouse, his fund, and his freedom. And it was all because of the sister he had thrown out into the freezing snow. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He let out a primal, guttural scream that echoed over the string quartet, silencing the entire ballroom. He dropped his champagne glass, letting it shatter violently against the marble floor, and lunged directly at me. His hands were outstretched, aiming right for my throat, his eyes wide with a violent madness. I stood my ground, staring right back at him as he charged. Harrison never reached my throat. Before his hands could even graze the silk of my dress, two massive venue security guards tackled him to the polished marble floor. He thrashed and screamed like a trapped animal, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom, shouting absolute nonsense about how I was stealing his life and ruining his firm. The remaining wealthy guests watched in silent, captivated horror as the impeccably dressed hedge fund manager was dragged out of his own charity gala in the middle of a complete public meltdown. Naomi was nowhere to be seen. She had likely fled through a side exit the moment Kenji Tanaka walked out the door, abandoning her husband to avoid the social humiliation. I calmly set my empty champagne glass on a passing waiter's tray, retrieved my thin wool coat from the cloakroom, and walked out into the freezing Chicago night. I had won the battle, but I knew my brother well enough to know the war was about to turn incredibly ugly. The next morning, I sat in a booth at a cheap neon-lit diner on the edge of the South Side. It was a stark contrast to the billionaire playground from the night before, but the stale coffee and the smell of fried eggs grounded me. I had my scuffed briefcase open on the scratched Formica table, carefully organizing the Ironclad Holdings documents. The clock was ticking loudly in my head. There were exactly 28 days left until the ground lease expired. I was running calculations on the precise square footage of his residential tower when the diner door chimed open, letting in a blast of freezing wind. A man in a cheap gray suit walked in, shaking the heavy snow off his umbrella. He scanned the quiet room, his eyes immediately locking onto me, sitting alone in the corner booth. He walked over briskly, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a thick manila envelope. "Are you Natalie?" he asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. I did not look up from my property calculations. "I am." He dropped the heavy envelope directly onto my paperwork. "You have been served," he said flatly. Without waiting for a response, he turned around and walked right back out into the snowstorm. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. I pushed my coffee cup aside, tore open the thick envelope, and pulled out a massive stack of legal filings stamped with the official seal of the Cook County Probate Court. It was an emergency ex parte injunction filed by an incredibly expensive downtown law firm representing my brother. I read through the primary allegations, my blood running completely cold at the absolute sheer audacity of his lies. Harrison was not suing me for corporate fraud. He was petitioning the court to have me declared legally incompetent. The legal document claimed I was severely mentally unstable, suffering from extreme delusions of grandeur, and entirely unfit to manage my own affairs, let alone oversee a commercial real estate holding company. I turned the page, and the betrayal deepened into something truly sickening. He had attached my private medical records. During my late 20s, when I was completely overwhelmed by the crushing daily burden of acting as the sole caregiver for our dying parents, I had gone to a grief counselor. I was exhausted, deeply depressed, and struggling to cope while Harrison and Naomi were off living their luxury life on private yachts. Now my own brother was weaponizing those private, painful therapy sessions. He was actively twisting the words of my counselor to paint me as a deeply disturbed woman who had maliciously manipulated our vulnerable father into signing over the factory during his final days. The legal petition demanded that Harrison be granted immediate legal conservatorship over me and all my financial assets to protect the family estate. It was a terrifying, brilliant legal maneuver. If he successfully convinced a judge that I was crazy, he would gain total control over Ironclad Holdings. He could instantly sign the ground lease renewal himself, save his hedge fund, and lock me away in a psychiatric facility or a cheap assisted living home for the rest of my life. He was trying to erase my basic human rights just to protect his bank account. I flipped to the final page, looking for the court mandate. A judge had already signed off on a preliminary hearing based on the fabricated medical urgency of Harrison's claims. The bold text at the bottom of the page ordered me to appear for a mandatory recorded deposition at the offices of Harrison's attorneys. I checked the date and time printed on the official summons. I had exactly 24 hours to prepare. If I did not show up, or if I broke down and cried under the immense pressure of his high-priced lawyers, the judge would grant the temporary conservatorship by default. Harrison genuinely thought my mental health was my weak point. He thought my history of grief made me fragile. He was about to find out that surviving his cruelty for 33 years had made my mind entirely bulletproof. Exactly 24 hours later, I walked through the heavy glass doors of Caldwell & Associates, one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms in Chicago. The deposition room was a glass box on the 40th floor, specifically designed for psychological warfare. The air conditioning was turned up to a freezing temperature, and a massive mahogany table dominated the space. Harrison and Naomi were already seated on one side, flanked by a team of 3 incredibly expensive lawyers. Naomi was wearing a tailored designer suit, looking at me with a smug, victorious sneer. A legal videographer was adjusting a camera pointed directly at a single isolated chair on the opposite side of the table. I sat down in the lonely chair. I did not bring a lawyer. When you possess the absolute truth and the raw data to back it up, you do not need someone else to speak for you. The lead attorney, a broad-shouldered man named Caldwell, with a predatory smile, started the recording. He launched straight into his attack using a rapid-fire interrogation technique designed to disorient and intimidate his targets. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to raise my voice, to bang my fists on the table, to do absolutely anything that he could clip and present to a judge as evidence of emotional instability. "Ms. Natalie, let us discuss your current living situation." Caldwell began, his voice dripping with loud condescension. "Is it true that you are entirely unemployed, that you have less than $500 to your name, and that you are currently squatting in an abandoned, condemned industrial property because you have absolutely nowhere else to go?" I looked directly into the camera lens. My posture was perfectly straight, and my voice was entirely devoid of emotion. I am a self-employed state-licensed commercial property appraiser. I am not squatting. I am currently occupying a legally deeded commercial parcel that I own outright free of any mortgage encumbrances. Caldwell slammed a thick medical file onto the table. Let us talk about your grip on reality. I have your private psychiatric records right here. 2 years ago, you underwent intensive therapy. You were diagnosed with severe depressive episodes. You told your medical provider you felt completely detached from reality and incapable of managing your own life. Does that sound like a woman who should be put in charge of a complex real estate holding company? Or does it sound like someone who manipulated her dying father into signing over his assets? Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms. He was waiting for the inevitable breakdown. He knew how much those therapy sessions meant to me. He knew I had gone to that counselor because the crushing weight of watching our parents slowly die was destroying me. Weaponizing my grief was the cruelest thing he could possibly do. But I did not break. I did not shed a single tear. I stared at Caldwell with a terrifying cold precision. I sought grief counseling after spending 5 years acting as the sole palliative caregiver for 2 terminally ill parents. I stated clearly, enunciating every single syllable for the microphone. It was a traumatic 24-hour-a-day medical burden that I shouldered entirely alone, while my brother spent that exact same period vacationing on private yachts and mismanaging his hedge fund. The clinical diagnosis I received was caregiver burnout, a perfectly normal physiological response to chronic stress. It was not psychosis. Recognizing my limits and seeking professional therapy is proof of my profound mental clarity, not the lack of it. Caldwell's predatory smile faltered. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but I completely cut him off, my voice slicing through the room like ice. Furthermore, if we are discussing competency, let the record show that less than 48 hours ago, I utilized commercial laser measurement tools to calculate the load-bearing capacity of a Class S steel foundation. I then presented that mathematical data to the Chief Director of Inspections at Chicago City Hall, proving unequivocally that a city inspector had filed a fraudulent demolition order on my property. The director immediately revoked the order and suspended the inspector. That is not the behavior of a delusional woman. That is the behavior of a highly competent commercial appraiser protecting her corporate assets from a coordinated illegal attack. The silence in the glass boardroom was absolute. The videographer looked uncomfortable. Naomi's smug sneer had completely vanished, replaced by a tense, nervous twitch in her jaw. Harrison was suddenly sitting straight up, his face pale. Caldwell tried to recover, raising his voice to regain control of the room. You are deflecting. You crashed a private charity gala and harassed a foreign billionaire with paranoid delusions about my client's business. You are trying to destroy his career because you are jealous. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at Harrison. I am not jealous of a man who is 30 days away from a catastrophic commercial default, I said softly. And I am not delusional. I simply own the dirt beneath his feet. Caldwell realized he was losing the narrative. The deposition was supposed to capture a hysterical, broken woman, but instead, he was providing the court with an hour of high-definition video proving I was the smartest, most legally lucid person in the room. He needed a new strategy, and I was about to give him exactly what he wanted. Caldwell stared at me across the massive mahogany table, his mouth slightly open, completely at a loss for words. The aggressive, high-priced corporate attorney had expected to break a fragile, grieving woman. Instead, he had just immortalized on high-definition video a perfectly lucid, legally unassailable defense that would get his emergency injunction thrown out of any courtroom in the country. He shuffled his thick stack of fabricated medical records, desperately searching for another angle of attack, but he had absolutely nothing left. The silence in the freezing glass boardroom was deafening, broken only by the soft mechanical hum of the air conditioning. I sat perfectly still, watching them scramble. I had won the deposition, but my analytical mind was already running the long-term calculations. Proving my sanity today would defeat the immediate threat of a conservatorship, But Harrison was a cornered animal with a massive legal budget. He could easily file a dozen more frivolous lawsuits, tying the factory up in probate litigation for months. I did not have months. The ground lease on Lot 402 expired in exactly 28 days. If we were tied up in a courtroom, when that clock ran out, the resulting legal chaos would be a nightmare to untangle. I needed to end this war immediately, and I needed to do it in a way that left my brother completely destroyed. I needed to set a trap, and to do that I needed to give Harrison exactly what his massive, fragile ego desired most: a public surrender. I took a slow, deep breath intentionally, letting it catch in my throat. I allowed my perfect rigid posture to collapse just a fraction of an inch. I slumped my shoulders forward, looked down at my hands resting on the table, and willed a slight nervous tremor into my fingers. I knew exactly how to play the exhausted, defeated sister. It was the exact version of me they had looked down upon for the last 5 years, while I drained my soul, caring for our dying parents. "I am so tired, Harrison," I said, lowering my voice so it sounded cracked and hollow. Caldwell stopped shuffling his papers. Naomi leaned forward instantly, her eyes lighting up like a predator that had just smelled blood in the water. I looked up, making sure my eyes appeared wide and desperate, focusing entirely on my brother. "I spent 5 years fighting to keep Dad alive, and now I have to sit in a freezing room and fight my own flesh and blood just to keep my freedom. I cannot do this anymore. I cannot spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder wondering when you are going to send the police or the doctors to lock me away." Harrison's posture shifted immediately. The terrified, desperate panic that had consumed him since the charity gala completely vanished. His spine straightened, and the familiar, arrogant smirk crept back onto his face. He actually believed he had won. He believed that the sheer psychological terror of threatening to lock me in a psychiatric ward had finally cracked my defenses despite my flawless performance on camera just moments ago. "If I give you what you want," I whispered, letting a single tear of fake defeat prick the corner of my eye. "If I sign the factory over to you and walk away forever, will you drop this lawsuit? Will you leave me alone?" Harrison raised his hand, signaling the videographer to cut the recording. The red light on the camera blinked out. He stood up slowly, buttoning his custom-tailored suit jacket, and looked down at me with absolute triumph. "You are finally thinking rationally, Natalie," he said, his voice dripping with loud condescension. "I told you I was going to protect this family's assets, and I meant it. But we are not doing this in the shadows. My investors and the residents of my building are completely spooked because of your little stunt at the gala. They think there is a genuine title dispute regarding the property. I need to put those rumors to rest permanently." He leaned across the mahogany table, his eyes locked onto mine. "Tomorrow night, the Penthouse Homeowners Association Board is holding an emergency meeting in our building's private conference center. The wealthiest, most powerful residents of the tower will be there along with my primary lenders. You are going to walk into that room at 8 o'clock sharp. You are going to publicly apologize for your hysterical behavior, and you are going to sign the quitclaim deed transferring the factory to Summit Edge Capital in front of every single one of them." Naomi smiled a vicious, satisfied smile. "And try to wear something appropriate this time," she chimed in. "Maybe that cheap wool coat. It really sells the charity case aesthetic we are going for." I kept my head bowed, hiding the absolute thrill racing through my veins. "Okay," I said softly. "I will be there." Caldwell slid a thick, unexecuted quitclaim deed across the table. I picked it up with trembling hands, placed it carefully into my scuffed briefcase, and stood up from the lonely chair. I walked out of the glass boardroom without looking back. When the heavy elevator doors finally slid shut, completely isolating me from them, the fake exhaustion vanished instantly. I stood up perfectly straight, a cold, surgical smile forming on my lips. Harrison wanted a public execution to stroke his ego. He had absolutely no idea he had just built his own scaffold. The private elevator doors glided open with a soft melodic chime, revealing the ultra-luxurious conference center on the top floor of the residential tower. It was exactly 8 o'clock the following night. I stepped out onto the plush custom-woven carpet, entirely ignoring the two massive security guards who immediately flanked me. Following Naomi's cruel advice from the deposition, I was wearing my scuffed boots and my thin, worn wool coat. I wanted to look exactly like the defeated, pathetic charity case they all expected to see. The room was a breathtaking monument to extreme wealth. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a spectacular sweeping view of the frozen Chicago skyline. A massive custom-built marble table dominated the center of the space, surrounded by plush leather executive chairs. The room was packed. Harrison had not just invited the Homeowners Association board members. He had gathered the most powerful, influential residents of the building, including tech CEOs, foreign dignitaries, and the senior vice presidents of the commercial bank that held the $300 million mortgage on the tower. They all turned to look at me as I walked into the room. Their faces were a sea of condescending pity and outright disgust. Harrison and his lawyers had clearly spent the entire day poisoning the well. These millionaires had been told a very specific story. They believed I was a deeply disturbed, mentally unstable woman who was trying to extort my brilliant brother with a fraudulent real estate claim. They looked at my scuffed boots and my cheap coat, entirely convinced I was a dangerous liability that needed to be swiftly removed from their pristine billionaire sanctuary. Naomi was holding court near the head of the table, looking absolutely radiant. Her rich dark skin glowed beautifully under the light of the cascading crystal chandeliers. She was wearing a breathtaking crimson designer dress, her wrists sparkling with heavy diamond bracelets. She held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, laughing softly with the wife of a major tech developer. When she saw me standing near the entrance, her smile widened into a terrifying mask of absolute victory. She raised her glass in my direction, a mocking silent toast to my complete and total destruction. She genuinely believed she had won. She thought her luxury lifestyle was permanently secured. I kept my head bowed, clutching my battered briefcase tightly against my chest, playing the role of the broken sister to absolute perfection. I walked slowly toward the only empty chair at the far end of the marble table. Every single step I took echoed in the dead silence of the room. I looked at the wealthy residents glaring at me. I looked at the bank executives in their tailored suits. None of them had any idea. They were sitting in a 50-story skyscraper sipping imported champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire empire was built on an expiring lease. They were sitting on a ticking time bomb, and I was holding the only key to defuse it. Harrison stood proudly at the head of the table. He looked like a titan of industry, perfectly composed in a charcoal gray suit flanked by Caldwell and his team of aggressive litigators. He waited until I took my seat before addressing the room. His voice was smooth, commanding, and dripping with fake empathy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board." Harrison began gesturing grandly toward me. "Thank you for gathering here on such short notice. As you all know, there have been some unfortunate, baseless rumors circulating regarding a minor title dispute on this property. I wanted to resolve this matter transparently. My sister Natalie has been going through a severe mental health crisis. In her confusion, she made some deeply inaccurate claims. But tonight, we are putting an end to this painful family chapter. We are here to officially clear the title and protect the integrity of Summit Edge Capital and your beautiful homes." The millionaires nodded in solemn agreement, murmuring their support for Harrison. He looked down the length of the marble table at me. The fake empathy in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, arrogant cruelty that only I could see. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out the crisp, legally binding quitclaim deed Caldwell had drafted the day before. Harrison placed his hand flat on the document and slid it forcefully down the smooth marble surface. The thick stack of papers glided perfectly, coming to a stop directly in front of my hands. He leaned forward, bracing his knuckles on the table, and delivered his final command in front of the most powerful people in Chicago. "Sign it, Natalie. Go back to your miserable little life." I stared at the thick stack of papers resting on the cold marble. The quitclaim deed. It was the legal instrument that would officially sign away Ironclad Holdings, the expiring ground lease, and my entire inheritance to Summit Edge Capital for exactly $0. Harrison stood over me, his chest puffed out, radiating the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had just successfully bullied his traumatized sister into total submission. But before I could even reach into my battered briefcase, Naomi decided that my silent surrender was not quite humiliating enough. She needed to put on a spectacular show. She set her crystal champagne flute down on the table with a sharp clink and stepped up to the head of the boardroom. She tapped a button on a sleek remote control, and the massive glass wall behind her seamlessly darkened, transforming into a state-of-the-art high-definition projection screen. A gorgeous architectural rendering flashed onto the display. It was a glossy, incredibly detailed image of a brand-new multi-level luxury parking garage, complete with a rooftop infinity pool, lush botanical gardens, and a private helipad. "Ladies and gentlemen," Naomi announced, her voice echoing with theatrical excitement. "While Harrison has been focused on protecting the strict legal integrity of our beautiful residential tower, I have been working closely with top city planners on how we can turn this unfortunate family distraction into a massive victory for the Homeowners Association. The rendering you are looking at is the immediate future of Lot 402. As soon as Natalie signs that piece of paper, we are sending in the commercial demolition crews to bulldoze her decaying toxic warehouse completely to the ground." She walked slowly around the marble table, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floor, until she was standing just a few feet away from my chair. She looked down at my scuffed boots and my cheap wool coat, her eyes filled with absolute, unfiltered venom. "We all know Natalie never had the vision or the financial capacity to maintain a commercial property," Naomi sneered, addressing the wealthy room, but keeping her piercing gaze locked entirely on me. "She wanted to hoard a dangerous rat-infested eyesore out of pure jealousy. But by tomorrow morning, that pathetic pile of bricks will be gone. It will be replaced by an exclusive amenity deck that will increase everyone's property values in this building by at least 15%. The room erupted into polite, highly enthusiastic applause. The tech CEOs and foreign dignitaries murmured their deep approval, raising their glasses to Naomi's brilliant real estate vision. The senior vice presidents of the commercial bank relaxed back into their plush leather chairs, completely satisfied that the minor title dispute was being handled with such profitable, aggressive efficiency. They were looking at the giant screen, admiring a parking garage that would never exist, built on a legal premise that was entirely fabricated. They were celebrating an absolute fantasy, completely ignorant of the financial slaughter waiting for them. Harrison leaned over the table, tapping the crystal face of his expensive gold watch. "Enough presentations, darling," he said smoothly to his wife, though his eyes never left my hands. "We have taken up enough of everyone's valuable evening." He pulled a heavy silver fountain pen from the inside pocket of his charcoal suit and tossed it carelessly onto the deed in front of me. It rolled slightly, stopping right next to the signature line. "Let us get this over with, Natalie. Sign the deed. Let the adults get back to business." I did not pick up his silver pen. Instead, I slowly reached down and unlatched the brass buckles of my battered briefcase. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly in the room, cutting right through the fading applause of the millionaires. I reached inside the dark leather interior. My fingers brushed past the heavy folder containing the ground lease, the laser measurement logs from City Hall, and the certified financial printouts proving Harrison's impending corporate default. I bypassed all of my father's meticulously hidden secrets and pulled out my own simple black ballpoint pen. I placed my briefcase securely on the floor by my boots and sat up perfectly straight. I clicked the top of my pen. The small, sharp sound seemed to suck all the remaining air out of the luxury conference center. I pulled the thick quitclaim deed closer to my chest, aligning it perfectly on the smooth marble surface. I pressed the tip of the pen directly against the bottom right corner of the legal document, hovering exactly 1 millimeter above the solid black signature line. Harrison stopped breathing. Naomi froze in her tracks, her triumphant smile suspended in time. The aggressive corporate litigators leaned forward in their chairs, their eyes completely fixated on my hand. Every single millionaire bank executive and investor in the room went dead silent, watching my pen waiting for me to surrender my empire. The tip of my black ballpoint pen hovered exactly 1 millimeter above the solid black signature line. I could feel the collective weight of the entire room pressing down on my shoulders. Dozens of millionaires, tech executives, and senior commercial bankers were holding their breath, waiting for the final stroke of ink that would erase my inheritance and secure their luxury empire. Harrison was leaning over the marble table, his eyes burning with absolute greed, a triumphant smirk permanently glued to his face. Naomi was already lifting her crystal champagne flute back to her lips, ready to take the celebratory sip the second my name hit the paper. I looked at the thick quitclaim deed. I looked at Harrison. And then I smiled. I did not sign my name. Instead, I smoothly pulled my hand back, placed the plastic cap over the tip of my pen, and pressed down. The sharp plastic snap echoed like a gunshot in the dead silence of the luxury conference center. I placed my pen neatly beside my battered briefcase. Then I placed my fingertips on the edge of the quitclaim deed and pushed it firmly away from me. The thick stack of legal papers glided rapidly across the polished marble surface, sliding all the way back down the length of the massive table until it bumped harshly against Harrison's silver fountain pen. The silence in the room instantly morphed into a thick, suffocating tension. The wealthy residents exchanged confused, irritated glances. Naomi froze, her champagne flute hovering inches from her mouth, her eyes darting frantically from the rejected contract to my perfectly calm face. "What the hell are you doing?" Harrison hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. He slammed his hands flat against the table. "Stop playing your pathetic little games, Natalie. Pick up the pen and sign the paper right now." I ignored his temper tantrum entirely. I reached back into the open leather interior of my briefcase and bypassed the junk. I pulled out the heavy, dark brown leather folder my father had left me. I opened it and carefully extracted a thick stack of documents. These were not cheap standard printer papers. These were heavy, watermarked legal parchments, stamped with the raised gold foil seal of the state of Illinois. I fanned them out neatly in front of me on the marble table, making sure the official municipal registry stamps were clearly visible to anyone paying attention. Caldwell Harrison's aggressive corporate litigator instantly stiffened. Even from 10 feet away, a seasoned real estate attorney knows exactly what a certified municipal title document looks like. His predatory confidence vanished, replaced by a sudden rigid panic. He leaned forward, squinting hard at the gold seals shining under the crystal chandeliers. I did not address my brother. I shifted my gaze directly to the three men in tailored navy suits sitting near the center of the table. "You three are the senior vice presidents of the commercial lending division, correct?" I asked smoothly, my voice projecting clearly across the room. "The executives who authorized the $300 million mortgage for this residential tower." The men blinked in surprise, clearly caught off guard by my sudden shift in tone. The tallest one, a man with silver hair and a sharp, calculating expression, slowly nodded. "Yes," he replied cautiously, "we are." I folded my hands and looked at him with the absolute, unshakable authority of a licensed commercial appraiser. "Then you need to listen to me very carefully. My brother invited you all here tonight to witness a surrender. He told you I was a mentally unstable woman trying to extort him with a fraudulent title dispute. He stood in front of this homeowners association and lied to your faces. The presentation his wife just gave regarding a luxury parking garage is a complete and total legal fabrication." Harrison's face turned a violent shade of crimson. "Shut her up!" he roared, completely losing his polished corporate composure. "Security." Get in here and drag this crazy woman out of my building right now. The two massive security guards stepped forward, reaching for my arms. But the silver-haired bank executive immediately held up his hand. Stop! The banker commanded his voice, cutting through the room with the crushing weight of a man who controls hundreds of millions of dollars. Nobody touches her. Let her speak. Harrison froze his mouth, opening and closing in absolute shock. He could not overrule his primary lender. The guards backed away immediately. I turned my attention back to my brother. He was standing at the head of the table, sweating profusely, watching his carefully constructed web of lies unravel in real time. I am not a crazy woman squatting in a toxic warehouse, I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clear precision. I am the sole proprietor of Ironclad Holdings, the company that holds the absolute title to Lot 402. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the heavy gold-sealed documents resting on the marble table. I am not here to sell my factory, Harrison. I am here to collect my rent. I picked up the thick stack of watermarked documents and began sliding copies across the smooth marble table. I made sure the senior vice presidents of the commercial lending division received the first set, followed by the president of the Homeowners Association. Finally, a copy slid directly in front of Naomi, who was staring at the paper as if it were coated in lethal poison. I stood up, pushing my chair back, and commanded the room with the practiced, undeniable authority of a senior commercial property appraiser. What you are holding is a master ground lease agreement, I explained, my voice steady and echoing clearly in the silent conference center. In the high-end commercial real estate market, there is a fundamental, non-negotiable difference between air rights and land rights. When the original developers broke ground on this magnificent 50-story tower decades ago, they did not buy the land beneath it. They leased it. They bought the right to occupy the air above Lot 402 for exactly 99 years. I walked slowly around the marble table, watching the color rapidly drain from the faces of the tech CEOs and foreign dignitaries as they read the bold legal print. Harrison purchased the controlling interest in this building, assuming he was buying a fee-simple estate. He arrogantly thought he was buying the dirt. But he only bought the leasehold. He owns the glass windows, the imported marble floors, and the high-speed elevators. But I own the physical earth anchoring this entire skyscraper to the ground. Every single one of you paid millions of dollars for a luxury penthouse that is currently trespassing on my private property. The silver-haired bank executive flipped frantically through the pages, his sharp eyes scanning the execution dates and the official municipal stamps. As a senior lender, the realization of the catastrophic financial exposure hit him instantly. He looked at Harrison with a mixture of absolute disgust and professional terror. The maturity date, the banker whispered, his voice trembling slightly. The lease term. It does not match the loan covenants. Harrison snapped. She is lying, he roared, his voice cracking violently. He slammed his fist down onto the marble table, his face a mask of frantic, unhinged desperation. Do not look at those papers. They are complete forgeries. I have the title insurance policies in my office safe right now. I have the fee, absolute deeds. My sister is a deeply disturbed, unemployed fraud who printed these out in a basement to extort this board. Caldwell, tell them. Harrison turned wildly to his aggressive corporate litigator, expecting him to tear my documents apart. But Caldwell was completely silent. The high-priced lawyer was staring at the raised state seal on the parchment in front of him. He knew a cheap forgery from a certified municipal original, and he knew his client had just committed a massive career-ending blunder by lying to a room full of billionaires and bank executives. I did not even blink at Harrison's screaming. I expected you to claim forgery, Harrison, I said calmly, returning to my spot at the end of the table. Which is exactly why I did not come here alone tonight. Right on cue, the heavy double doors of the luxury conference center swung open. A tall, sharply dressed man walked into the room carrying a sleek tablet. He was not a cheap public defender. He was Jonathan Pierce, one of the most feared and widely respected commercial real estate attorneys in the entire state of Illinois. Jonathan walked straight to the head of the table, entirely ignoring Harrison and Naomi. He bypassed them, completely unplugged the presentation cable from Naomi's laptop, and plugged it directly into his own device. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan said, his voice a deep, commanding baritone that instantly demanded respect. My client, the sole proprietor of Ironclad Holdings, anticipated that her brother might attempt to dispute the physical paperwork. So, we decided to pull the live, uneditable municipal registry directly from the Cook County Assessor Secure server. The massive glass projection screen behind Naomi flickered. The glossy fabricated rendering of the luxury parking garage vanished instantly. In its place, the stark, undeniable interface of the government database illuminated the dark room. Jonathan typed in the exact parcel identification number for Lot 402. The secure server loaded, displaying the legal ownership records in massive black text for the entire room to see. The registered owner was Ironclad Holdings. The managing director was listed as Natalie. And highlighted in bright red at the very bottom of the screen was the active ground lease status. There was no forgery. There was no delusion. The government database was absolute, undeniable proof. The room stared at the massive screen in pure, paralyzed horror, realizing that the woman in the scuffed boots held their entire world in the palm of her hand. The projection screen bathed the luxurious conference room in a harsh and unforgiving white light. I stood at the end of the massive marble table, letting the absolute reality of the government database sink into the minds of the wealthiest people in Chicago. No one spoke. The only sound in the entire room was the faint hum of the climate control system and the ragged, panicked breathing of my brother. The high-definition display behind him was undeniable. Ironclad Holdings was the sole proprietor of the land, and the ground lease status was glowing in bright red text. I slowly raised my left arm and pushed back the sleeve of my thin wool coat to look at my watch. It was exactly 8:15 in the evening. I tapped the glass face of my watch with my index finger, ensuring every single pair of eyes in the room was focused on my movements. The original ground lease for Lot 402 was signed exactly 99 years ago, I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a scalpel. And according to the ironclad terms of that contract, the lease expired at exactly midnight last night. The collective gasp from the Homeowners Association board members was audible. The silver-haired bank executive dropped his pen. It clattered loudly against the polished marble. He understood exactly what that meant, but my attorney, Jonathan Pierce, decided to make it perfectly clear for the rest of the room. Jonathan stepped forward, addressing the senior commercial lenders directly. "Gentlemen, you all know the Illinois Commercial Code. When a master ground lease expires without a signed renewal, all physical improvements made to the parcel instantly and legally revert to the landowner. That includes the foundation, the steel framework, the imported marble floors, and every single residential unit in this tower. As of midnight last night, Summit Edge Capital lost all legal claim to this property. Your $300 million mortgage is now entirely unsecured and the loan is in immediate incurable default." Absolute chaos erupted among the millionaires. A prominent tech executive slammed his fists on the table, shouting at Harrison, demanding to know how he could have hidden a catastrophic title defect from the board. The foreign dignitaries began speaking rapidly to their translators, their faces pale with panic. They had all paid millions of dollars for luxury penthouses that they no longer legally owned. Naomi let out a sharp, hysterical sound that was half gasp and half sob. She stumbled backward, bumping heavily into the glass presentation screen that just moments ago was displaying her ridiculous parking garage. The vintage champagne she was holding spilled down the front of her expensive crimson designer dress, looking exactly like fresh blood. But she did not even notice the stain. She was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely paralyzed by the realization that her billionaire lifestyle had just been legally erased. The luxury realtor who had mocked my clothes and called me a charity case was suddenly the poorest woman in the room. Harrison shook his head violently. "No!" he whispered, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the words. He grabbed the edge of the marble table, looking at me with pathetic, tear-filled eyes. "No, Natalie, please. We are family. You cannot do this to me. The bank will seize the hedge fund. My investors will destroy me. I will go to federal prison for fraud." I stared at him, feeling absolutely zero pity. "You did not care about family when you kicked me out into a freezing blizzard at 2 in the morning," I replied, my tone completely flat and devoid of emotion. "You did not care about family when you weaponized my grief and tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward just to steal my inheritance. You played a ruthless game of corporate monopoly, Harrison. You just forgot to check who actually owned the board." I reached into my battered briefcase one final time. I pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper. It was not a court order or a medical file. It was a brand new, highly customized commercial lease agreement drafted by my attorney just hours before this meeting. I walked up the length of the marble table, cutting right through the shouting billionaires, and placed the document directly over Harrison's silver fountain pen. "These are my new terms," I said, leaning in so close I could see the cold sweat dripping down his face. "I am willing to grant Summit Edge Capital a retroactive emergency extension on the ground lease to keep this residential building from going into immediate municipal foreclosure. But the price of the dirt has gone up." Harrison stared at the paper, his eyes frantically scanning the numbers printed in bold black ink. His jaw dropped open. "This is insane," he choked out, his voice cracking. "This is financial extortion." I stood up straight and addressed the entire room of horrified millionaires and panicked bank executives. "The new lease is $20 million a year, payable immediately to Ironclad Holdings. I expect the first wire transfer to clear my corporate account by noon tomorrow. If Summit Edge Capital cannot afford the rent, or if anyone in this room wishes to dispute my legal claim, I am completely fine with that. You have exactly 30 days to pack up this entire 50-story skyscraper and move it off my lawn." The luxury conference room exploded into absolute pandemonium. The quiet, polite veneer of high society completely shattered the moment the word foreclosure left my mouth. A prominent tech CEO, the same man who had just enthusiastically applauded the fantasy parking garage, slammed his open hands down on the marble table. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Harrison's face, his voice roaring over the chaos. He demanded the immediate return of the $7 million he had paid for his penthouse, threatening to personally fund a massive class action lawsuit against Summit Edge Capital for gross misrepresentation and corporate fraud. The foreign dignitaries were frantically dialing their own legal teams, shouting rapid orders to freeze any pending investments connected to my brother. The silver-haired bank executive did not yell. He simply stood up calmly, buttoned his tailored navy jacket, and looked down at Harrison with the cold, detached expression of an executioner. He announced that as of this exact moment, the commercial lending division was freezing every single operating account associated with Summit Edge Capital. He advised Harrison to secure a very good criminal defense attorney because the bank would be forwarding the fraudulent loan covenants directly to the federal authorities by morning. Harrison spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot, desperately searching for a lifeline. He grabbed the sleeve of his aggressive corporate litigator, practically begging the man to do something to file an emergency injunction to find a loophole. Caldwell violently yanked his arm out of my brother's grip. The high-priced lawyer snapped his thick leather briefcase shut with a sharp, final click. Caldwell stated in a booming voice that his firm did not represent clients who deliberately concealed catastrophic title defects and lied to their own legal counsel. Without another word, the entire legal team walked out of the glass boardroom, abandoning their client to the wolves. Harrison was hyperventilating, his custom charcoal suit completely soaked in nervous sweat. He turned to the only person left on his side of the room, Naomi. Naomi was standing frozen near the high-definition projection screen, her beautiful crimson designer dress stained with spilled champagne. She looked like a ghost. Harrison reached out to her with trembling hands, his voice cracking as he tried to piece his shattered reality back together. "Naomi, listen to me," he pleaded, stepping toward her. We can fix this. I have offshore accounts. We can liquidate the Cayman assets and hire a new legal team. We just need to stay united. Naomi looked at his outstretched hands, and then she looked up at his face. The expression she wore was not pity, and it certainly was not love. It was absolute, unadulterated disgust. She slapped his hands away with such force that the sound echoed sharply over the shouting millionaires. "Do not touch me," she hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You arrogant, incompetent fool. You told me this building was a fortress. You promised me absolute security. You leveraged everything we had on a piece of land you did not even bother to properly investigate. You are not a titan of Wall Street, Harrison. You are a bankrupt fraudster who is about to spend the next 20 years in a federal prison." Harrison recoiled as if he had been physically struck. "Naomi, please!" He choked out, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "You are my wife." Naomi let out a harsh, bitter laugh that held absolutely no warmth. "I married a winner, Harrison. I am not going down with a sinking ship, and I am certainly not spending the best years of my life visiting you through a pane of glass." She reached down to her left hand. With one swift, violent motion, she pulled the massive diamond wedding ring off her finger. She threw it directly at him. The heavy platinum ring hit his chest, bounced off, and clattered loudly onto the polished marble table. It spun in a tight, glittering circle before coming to a dead stop. Without a single backward glance, Naomi turned on her designer heels and stormed out of the conference center, leaving him completely, utterly alone. The room was quickly emptying out as the panicked millionaires rushed to the elevators to begin salvaging their own financial lives. Within minutes, the only people left in the sprawling, luxurious space were my attorney Jonathan, myself, and my brother. The reality of his total destruction finally crushed his legs. Harrison let out a pathetic, suffocating sob and physically collapsed. He dropped to his knees right there on the custom-woven carpet, his tailored suit pooling around him. He crawled forward, reaching out with shaking, sweaty hands to grab the hem of my thin wool coat. "Natalie, please," he openly wept, looking up at me with a face entirely ruined by terror and defeat. "I am begging you. Have mercy on me. We are family. You are my sister. Please do not take my life away." I looked down at the man who had thrown me into a blizzard at 2 a.m. I looked at the brother who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward to steal my inheritance. I reached down firmly, pulled the fabric of my coat out of his desperate grip, and stepped right past him. The television screen in the main lobby glowed brightly, displaying the breaking news chyron across the bottom of the broadcast. A federal judge in Chicago today handed down a 15-year sentence to former hedge fund manager Harrison. The news anchor announced, his voice crisp and professional. The founder of the now bankrupt Summit Edge Capital was convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, securities violations, and deliberately concealing catastrophic commercial title defects from his institutional investors. The judge noted his complete lack of remorse during sentencing. I reached out and pressed the power button on the remote control, cutting the anchor off mid-sentence. The massive flat screen went black. I set the remote down on the sleek glass conference table and took a deep, centering breath. 6 months had passed since that chaotic night in the luxury conference center. The brutal, freezing Chicago winter had finally melted away, replaced by a warm and vibrant summer. I walked across the imported marble floor, the soft click of my heels echoing in the massive space, and pushed open the heavy glass doors leading out to the wraparound balcony. The warm wind off Lake Michigan brushed against my face as I stepped out into the sunlight. I walked to the edge of the glass railing and looked down at the sprawling, magnificent city below me. I was standing on the balcony of the exact same $8 million penthouse where just 6 months ago I had been thrown out like a piece of worthless garbage at 2 a.m. But this penthouse did not belong to Harrison anymore. When his ground lease officially expired, the commercial bank immediately called in his $300 million loan. Because his hedge fund was entirely over-leveraged and instantly insolvent, the state of Illinois executed the legal reversion clause. Everything built on Lot 402 reverted to the landowner. I allowed the innocent residents of the Homeowners Association to sign new fair leases directly with Ironclad Holdings so they would not lose their homes. But I absolutely refused to extend that same courtesy to my brother. I legally seized his penthouse to cover the unpaid rent and penalties. The space behind me was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant bachelor pad Harrison had designed. Naomi's velvet sofas, her expensive wine fridge, and her ridiculous luxury Pilates equipment had been completely hauled away to an auction house. In their place stood rows of sleek architectural drafting tables, high-end dual-monitor workstations, and floor-to-ceiling whiteboards covered in complex municipal zoning algorithms. This was no longer a party house. It was the brand-new corporate headquarters of Ironclad Commercial Appraisal and Holding. I had expanded my firm, hiring a dozen of the sharpest structural engineers and real estate analysts in the state. We no longer appraised suburban strip malls. We managed billion-dollar portfolios, and our reputation for absolute bulletproof accuracy was unmatched in the entire city. As for the decaying textile factory in the South Side, the building Naomi had illegally tried to demolish it was currently wrapped in construction scaffolding. I had leveraged the equity of the residential tower to secure a massive commercial redevelopment loan. We were using that incredible over-engineered steel foundation my father had left me to build a state-of-the-art community center and tech incubator. We were bringing jobs, resources, and life back to a neighborhood the city had completely forgotten. I was turning my father's hidden anchor into a beacon. Harrison was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary, his arrogant corporate facade entirely stripped away. Naomi filed for divorce the very morning after the gala, but she could not escape the blast radius of his fraud. Because her name was legally tied to several of his shell companies, the state board permanently revoked her luxury real estate license. The woman who once wore heavy diamond bracelets and mocked my cheap wool coat was now completely bankrupt. Last I heard, she was working as a front desk receptionist at a budget motel near the airport. It was the exact place she had told me to go when she thought she held all the power. I leaned my hands against the warm glass railing of the balcony, looking out at the horizon. For 33 years I had let my brother and his wife mock me. I let them call me a loser, a charity case, and a worthless burden. They genuinely believed that because I chose to care for our dying parents instead of chasing a luxury lifestyle, I was weak. They mistook my patience for stupidity, and they mistook my silence for submission. But real power does not need to shout. Real power does not need to throw tantrums in a cafe or brag to billionaires at a charity gala. Real power is knowing the exact structural foundation of the room you are standing in. My father knew I was the anchor of this family, and in the end, I used my brain, not my mouth, to tear down a paper empire and build a real one in its place. Have you ever had a family member mistake your silence for weakness? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more stories of surviving toxic family dynamics and taking back your power. The greatest lesson from this entire ordeal is that true power always lies in the foundation, never in the facade. Society often conditions us to measure success by the loudest voices, the flashiest lifestyles, or the most aggressive displays of dominance. We are taught to be intimidated by people who wear their wealth and status like an impenetrable suit of armor. Harrison and Naomi built their entire identities on this exact illusion of superiority. They believed that holding the title to a beautiful glass penthouse made them untouchable titans of the world. But they completely ignored the dirt it was built on. In life, just as in commercial real estate, the shiny surface means absolutely nothing if the core structure is completely hollow. When toxic people try to tear you down, belittle your achievements, or call you a failure, they usually do it to distract everyone from their own fragile reality. They project their deepest insecurities onto you, desperately hoping you will break under the pressure before their own house of cards inevitably collapses. My ultimate survival depended on recognizing that my silence was never a weakness. When my own family weaponized my grief and insulted my quiet career, the natural human instinct was to scream to violently defend myself and to try and prove my worth on their terms. But reacting emotionally only gives toxic manipulators the exact control they crave. By staying quiet, meticulously observing their critical mistakes, and trusting my own hard-earned expertise, I allowed their blinding arrogance to become the exact tool of their destruction. You never need to shout to prove your value to people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding you. Just secure your foundation, do the quiet work, and let the undeniable truth speak for itself. If you have ever had to quietly rebuild your life while toxic people tried to tear you down, hit the subscribe button and share your story in the comments below so we can continue building a foundation of strength together.